All right, so hello everybody. My name is Kasha. I'm going to be the one moderating today. So a couple things. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand at the end of the presentation, or you can post it in the Q&A section. If there is more than 30 people, we prefer that everybody posts to the Q&A, but if it's under 30 people, feel free to raise your hand, and then we will get to the questions at the end of Leila's presentation. A little overview about Leila. She received her master's in environment and sustainability in 2012. Since then, she has worked in the waste management industry for about 7 years. She learned a lot about nonprofits, people and project management, and also about how sustainability decisions are made in organizations. Before the pandemic, she started her own carbon consultancy business. She worked with startups and small, medium-sized enterprises to access the carbon footprint of their ideas or their organizations. Her favorite part of this work is the strategic planning that follows data collection and emission calculations. Recently, she has started a new role as a senior strategy associate at BWD Strategic. All right. Thank you so much for being here, Leila and everybody, and I will let you take the lead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kasha. And thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to be here today and share a little bit about what I've learned in my career journey so far. Like Kasha said, my favorite part of doing this kind of work and just being in sustainability field in general is making informed decisions, right? We don't have to make decisions based off of our gut or what we think is the right choice, but we actually have a lot of science, a lot of data and evidence to use to make the right strategic decision, not only for ourselves, but for the worlds around us. So I've prepared some slides and I will share them in a moment, and that will just guide the conversation today. Like I mentioned, just we can have Q&A at the end of the talk today. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we'll get started. Sorry, Zoom doesn't have permission to share. I have to quit.
Let me try and mess with it on my end.
Oh, I think I got it.
Perfect, you got it.
All right.
I can
Sorry,
see.
okay. Yeah, it's just giving me some notifications. I'm still new to Apple. Okay, wonderful. So let's begin. We'll talk about evidence-based strategy. So I thought it would be perhaps interesting to talk about these three different kinds of work that I've done in the past and how evidence from within each method or approach can be used to make decisions. So we're going to talk about carbon inventory, which is what I did when I had my own business, waste audit, which is what I did when I was in the nonprofit world before starting my business, and double materiality, which is not exactly what I do these days at BWD, but it's part of what BWD does. It's just not my direct line of work. So I'm still getting familiar with it. I feel like I know enough to actually speak about double materiality. So these are the three topics for today, and we'll get started for carbon accounting. Okay, so for each kind of scenario, I have an example to share. So let's say company A wants to become net zero, or maybe just carbon neutral. I won't get into the differences, but that's what their objective is. They want to reach net zero. However, they don't really know where or how to begin implementing low carbon solutions. So right now it's just an idea. And so as I go through these examples, I'm going to talk about like what's the objective, what's the problem, what's the approach, and also because Terra.do is about it's basically a school, and I think many of you might be transitioning to this field or other fields within the sustainability realm. I'll talk about who would be the right person or what kind of makes sense in terms of the person who is actually doing this work, like what kind of skills you need to have, what should you maybe like to do if you want to do this kind of work, and so forth, just to help with that career portion as well. So in order to get to a net zero carbon neutrality, we need to figure out where we are, right? We can't manage what we don't measure, as the saying goes. So in terms of carbon neutrality or net zero, the approach to help us get to this end goal is to conduct a carbon inventory, and other names for it are also GHG accounting or carbon accounting. And like I mentioned, this is what I did when I had my own business. So in essence, it's a way to measure the carbon footprint of a business. And many of you may be already familiar with this idea. So please forgive me if I'm duplicating myself or what you already know. So the carbon footprint of a business is measuring all the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted as the company is operating. And it includes the direct emissions that are coming from, let's say, the fleet and the vehicles that they operate on the road, the facilities and the sites that they have, but it also includes their indirect emissions that's coming from their supply chain as well. So whether they're buying goods and services from their suppliers, or they're using third party to ship their products out to customers, and also like the packaging, what happens to the packaging after the consumers deal with it or they're done with it. All of that is indirect emissions, and all that would be included in their carbon inventory. So an example of what this looks like is something that you see on your screen here. So this I've taken from Maple Leaf Foods, which is kind of like a processed meat packaging company in Canada, which is where I used to live. And so what you see here on your screen is a bunch of different size circles and different colored circles. Scope 3 is those indirect emissions that I was talking about within their supply chain. And scope 3 for most companies is the biggest source of emissions. So what you see here is scope 3 is the yellow, and that's what majority of their emissions is those scope 3 emissions. So some of the biggest sources, yeah, hopefully you can see my mouse, is the third-party contractor growers for their hog and poultry. It can also be the feed and the crop production that they're feeding to the animals. It also includes packaging materials, waste, freight, road and sea and rail transport, etc. So there's a lot that goes into scope 3. Scope 1, which is their direct emissions, you see in blue, and then scope 2, which is related to their energy usage, mostly purchasing electricity, heat, or steam, is what you see in green. So it's it tends to be a smaller amount. What's interesting about this is that at a snapshot, you can see where most of their emissions come from. So scope 3, it accounts for 78% of their emissions. Scope 2 is 1.7, and scope 1 is about 20% of their overall emissions. So if a company is saying, okay, we want to be carbon neutral in 10 years, we got to understand, where are we right now? Where are most emissions coming from? And based on the information that we have right now, so what's on your screen, then we can put together a plan to prioritize where we can invest our resources and our time and energy to implement some better alternatives. So, for example, if a company doesn't know where to begin, what to do, they're saying, oh, we should cancel all air travel because using airplanes is really bad for the environment. Let's just cancel that. Well, if we look at this chart, we see that business travel, which is done by air, is actually 0.2% of their um, of their scope 3 emissions. So it's a pretty small amount. Whereas the packaging materials is 8%. So maybe it makes more sense to focus on the emissions that are coming from their packaging materials or their waste. That's 5%, right? So it just gives you a better idea of what should be a low-hanging fruit versus something that we may need to focus on in future years and put it as part of their long-term plan. So that's the piece that I love about doing this work is that at a snapshot, we don't need to guess anymore of like what should be priority, what shouldn't be. We know after doing this inventory what we should focus on. Another very common action item that comes out of doing carbon inventory is that, as you can see here, their third-party contractors make up a majority of their emissions. And maybe to have like 200 different suppliers. We don't really know, any more than what you see on your screen. But sometimes a huge takeaway from doing carbon inventory is that we need to collect better, more accurate information. And I think that is going to tell companies a lot. So if their emissions are coming mostly from their suppliers that are growing their chickens and their pigs, etc., maybe there are some growers that are doing better than others. They're managing their emissions more effectively, or they're just managing their farm more effectively. And until they get that granular data, they can't really manage or make better decisions, right? So a common takeaway from doing this work is, hey, how can we gather better information, better data to give us more insight so we can make better decisions? So that's the example for carbon inventory. We're going to move on to example number 2. So this is related to doing waste audits. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But let's say company B wants to lower their waste and recycling costs. So they may have plans to become a zero waste facility in the future. But right now, they're noticing that quarter after quarter, year over year, their bills when it comes to waste and recycling continue to increase, and they're not sure what's happening. The invoices are kind of hard to read. I've been in this world. The invoices are intentionally very ambiguous and open to endless kind of increases. It's a kind of an interesting world. So they're paying a lot for those services, and they're not sure why. And this is where it makes a lot of sense to conduct a waste audit. So waste audit is a methodology used to understand the composition and the quantity of waste that is produced. So typically what happens in a waste audit, and it can be as comprehensive and as elaborate as you want it to be, or it could be very quick and high level, but of course, depending on how much time you invest in it, the better information and data you can collect. But what happens in a waste audit is that you're saying, okay, we're going to take all the trash that's produced within the next day or 3 days or whatever. We're going to take all the trash, we're going to set it aside, and we're going to systematically go through it. So we're going to open the bags and we're going to categorize the waste based on plastics, organics, the paper, the cans, etc. And we're going to weigh it and we're going to determine how much of each category is made up in our waste. And the same thing can be done for recycling streams as well. So you can say, okay, all of the recycling that's going into those bins, hold off, don't throw them in the bins just yet, but let's go through them. Let's assess what's actually in them. So this is going to help to measure the effectiveness of recycling programs. So if you go through your recycling bin and that's supposed to be all paper and cardboard, and you find that, oh, actually there's 30% here that's, I don't know, cans or is tissue, things that shouldn't be there, that tells you a lot, right? That tells you that there's 30% contamination rate. And maybe that's why we're paying a lot for in our bills, because we're paying for contamination fees. And so that's something that the waste haulers have to manually take out. And so they're charging us for their fees, right? So they're passing off those costs to us. So let's show what typically what this can look like. So again, depending on how you've set up your waste audit and what information you're wanting to collect, it can kind of sort of look like this, right? So what you find is that, okay, we've gone through our trash, 83% of it is recyclable. This may or may not be a waste stream. It's just a graphic that I found. 83% of it is recyclable. The rest is non-recyclable. So we're assuming that it's trash. And then you can dig deeper within each category. So of the recyclables, how much of them are containers, how much of it is paper, and of those containers, how much is coffee cups that may or may not be recyclable, how much of it is plastic, what's wax, etc. And you can also mix um, further divide it out into what's organics, what's paper, what's the raw nitrogen, what's the transformed nitrogen, and so forth. So this tells you a lot of information. So again, like, what's the outcome of this type of work? The outcome is that you know how well your recycling or how effective your recycling programs are. And I can tell you right now that, I've been doing this work in the past, and sometimes it doesn't matter how pretty your signage is or how clear you think it is or how many different languages you have in your signage and your labels for these recycling programs, because there's always something that you may have missed that you just don't know about, and until you do a waste audit you don't know what hasn't been communicated clearly. For anyone who's in this world and wants to do better in terms of setting up recycling programs, a good tip is to set up an I don't know bin or an IDK, I don't know bin. So this only really works when you're first implementing some recycling programs. And an I don't know bin is, hey, we rolled out recycling programs. If there's anything that you're not really sure where to put it, toss it in the I don't know bin, and we'll sort through it later. And so that, again, gives you a lot of information of like what's really confusing to people. This only kind of works when it's internal recycling programs and not the outward facing, the public programs. Um, the one thing that I didn't mention for the last example is the kind of work that you'd be doing or the kind of personality who would be best suited for doing work related to waste audits. Um, Obviously, like literally and figuratively, it would be the kind of person who likes to get their hands dirty. But also, I think it's people who are intrigued by operations, who love the idea of like Kaizen and Six Sigma and like just love to make sure that things just run efficiently and a little bit better. And so this is kind of part of it. I did lots of waste audits in the past, and like that part of me is still there where I just sneak in and take a look into people's garbage just because I'm fascinated, right? And I think what we throw out and what's in our garbage tells us a lot about our society. So just a mini little story about when I used to do this work for a thrift-based nonprofit. I would do waste audits at different retail sites, and I did this one waste audit at a location which was fairly like low income community. And the managers of that store were complaining to me about how there's always kids going through their garbage every single day, and how their parents aren't doing a good job, and why are there kids in our garbage? And I don't debate that. I think yes, there's definitely some responsibility on the side of the parents, but it also begs the question of what's in your garbage. Like, why are kids finding it so interesting to go through your garbage? There's obviously more than just garbage in your waste. And so yes, we found that there's lots of toys and lots of goodies that they were throwing out that should have been going to the warehouse and giving it a second or third chance for it to sell. So yeah, I think what's in our garbage is really telling of us. As a society. All right, and the third example. So company C is, let's say, a larger company, and they are required to complete a double materiality assessment. So this example, and again, like I mentioned, this is a bit of a newer example for me, just because I'm I'm new to this role at BWD. Um, so for a double materiality assessment, it may be part of a regulatory requirement. And so in the EU, for instance, for CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it mandates that certain companies of a certain size need to conduct a double materiality assessment as part of their sustainability reporting. Or it may also be part of a framework. So, as part of the GRI, so the Global Reporting Initiative or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, so SASB, it does emphasize the importance of considering both the financial and the non-financial impact. So that's what a double materiality is. So they may be required to conduct this DMA as part of these either standards or requirements. But how we conduct the DMA is super crucial, and this is what I want to get into. But a double materiality is really a concept used primarily in sustainable reporting and corporate governance that's considering both sides of financial materiality, so like how a sustainability issue affects the financial performance of a company. So climate change is real. So how is that going to impact your company? Do you really rely on water, and water is going to be scarce in the coming years? So how is that going to impact the company? And it also looks at the inside out. So how is the company impacting their stakeholders and the world around them? So whether that's the actual environment and the ecosystems, but also the communities, their internal employees, the workers within their supply chain, all that needs to be considered. So in essence, it's just encouraging organizations to look beyond traditional financial metrics to understand their broader impacts and also their responsibilities as well. So what I mentioned was that how we conduct a double materiality assessment, like that's the crucial piece. And it's interesting to see that big consulting firms, like even like the Big Four, all they really do sometimes is just do peer review and say like, okay, we know that your company is, let's say, is in electronics, kind of like a Samsung. We're going to look at Apple. We're going to look at, I don't know, Nokia, and we're going to see what they're doing. And that's going to inform us. Okay, so we're going to put together some risks, impacts, and opportunities. We're going to just interview your internal stakeholders. We might do some surveys. We're going to ask them to rank these impacts, risks, and opportunities based on like numbers, 1 to 5 of like, what's material to your business. And then we're going to put together an action plan and off you go. But you can see why only interviewing internal stakeholders is very subjective, right? So this same electronic company is likely sourcing some minerals and some key components to their products that may, let's say, come from conflict areas, right? So, sorry, I just lost my spot. And so there's just growing scrutiny when it comes to their supply chain, particularly like where they're sourcing their minerals from. So, for example, tungsten, it can come from areas where it's a conflict affected region, and so sourcing those minerals can fund violence and basically just human rights issues that we're trying to avoid in our world, right? So there's growing concern over where are we actually sourcing these minerals from. And so if their peers are not looking into this, and internally no one's raising any concerns about their minerals and where they're sourcing them, this can completely get missed. So this is where it makes a lot of sense, and it's absolutely, I think, a must-have to do a little bit more research and use evidence to support our work. So a good analogy to consider for this kind of materiality stuff is that if someone were to ask you, what is the best way for us to create value as a business? it's a tough question, right? Because for many would agree that it's kind of like an unrealistic question to answer. Several different strategies may seem promising, um, but because we don't have a perfect information and can't predict the future, it's impossible to decide what would be like the one best answer, right? So instead, we must come to a consensus on which strategy makes the most sense right now, and then adapt over time as information and circumstances change. So this is the essence of like, any kind of strategic planning process. So although we may not be completely right, it is possible that we could be completely wrong because some strategies we can agree just don't make sense, right? And so the same goes for a materiality assessment. The same kind of philosophy goes for a materiality assessment. There is no single value for each impact that will stand across time and stakeholders, cultural, regional, that geographic context. But there are limits based on stakeholder engagement, and we can still do that, but also based on science and other methodologies that can inform that upper and lower bounds of, the acceptable results. We cannot provide the one best answer because there isn't one, but instead, our job, or at least as consultants, is to facilitate a consensus on material impacts, risks, and opportunities within the bounds set by stakeholders, science, and regulatory requirements. And so what we can do is that we can seek a consensus based on the information available now, and then revisit the assessment each year as information and circumstances change. So just to give an example, oh, sorry, this is a graphic for what a double materiality is. It's kind of like a impact outwards and impact inwards from the business to the environment and vice versa. But some example of sources of evidence for double materiality assessments, like, it's kind of endless. So a very basic one is a GHG inventory report. So of course, any business has some kind of footprint. And this doesn't need to be subjective anymore. We can just look at their GHG inventory report and say, yes, you have this much in terms of your scope 1 or 3 emissions, right? Like what we already looked at. We can look into those conflict minerals and determine whether they're sourcing them from, those conflict affected regions. We can look at science-based targets and do science-based target nature assessments, which is looking at biodiversity and ecosystems and how those are affected locally based on the operations of a business. So a company may be oblivious to how their operations and how the pollution actually impacts their local geographic area. And until you do this kind of assessment, which is based on science and decades of research has gone into it, until we do this work, they may actually not know what impact they're having on their local environment. There's also climate risk assessment, environmental impact assessment, which is again like looking at a more holistic impact to the environment based on like a new projects that they're setting up. So this is especially important for, let's say, building new constructions, especially if they're close to environmentally sensitive areas. So there's just like so much information that can be used to help us do these assessments. There's life cycle assessments that help us to understand what is the carbon footprint of a product and like how can it be reduced or how can it be just improved in general. The supply chain audits, which help us to understand perhaps as it relates to human rights and due diligence process, like what are we doing, where's the impact, and help companies and also consultants to actually talk to the stakeholders which are affected by their operations instead of just focusing internally and having a very subjective view. So there's lots of evidence and the science out there to help us do this work. And to go back to that career discussion of like who would enjoy this kind of work, I think it's people that kind of understand like the broader impact of an organization on on the broader stakeholders. So whether it's the communities or the environment, and someone who is just curious about the role of business in our environment and likes to ask those tough questions of, hey, what are you doing for your due diligence? What kind of remedy procedures do you have in place when there is an incident? And how are you rectifying that? How are you reporting on that? What do you plan to do better next time? So it's really interesting. I think there's a lot that is involved, and of course, every industry, every sector is a little bit different. But I think it just requires a little bit more of like a holistic view of businesses and just understanding what operation and how their operations can impact, especially within their supply chain. So. I think that would be the kind of person who would be interested in doing this kind of work. And like I said, I'm still new to it, and it's not my core work at BWD. And I just wanted to go back to, before we open it up for questions, to carbon inventory and talk about, again, like who would enjoy this kind of work. It would be someone who really likes digging into the details, who likes to crunch numbers and just work in Excel sheets, who likes that attention to detail and like making sure you have the right emission factor for doing these calculations, and just probably likes math, even though it's pretty basic math. But yeah, I think that would be the kind of person who would enjoy carbon inventory work. Um, I don't really have like a wrap up slide or anything, but I'll just open it up to questions and see what comes up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Leila. So a few questions came in our chat. The first question was, can you share some of the tangible actions that came out of the waste audits with the company's organization you did this with?
Yeah, certainly. Um, yeah, a lot of good stuff. So, okay, going back to that example of the retail site who was putting a lot of toys in their garbage, and that's why the kids were going through their garbage. Um, so what came out of that was that the retail site was saying, yeah, we're throwing out all these toys, etc., that should be going to the warehouse, um, because we don't have space for it. We don't have space to put it in another box and have that box go to the warehouse. So it's just easier for us to put it in the garbage. And I did understand that because we had 20 plus different kind of categories in our recycling stream, and they just didn't have room uh, in their back room to have 20 different boxes set up. So we had to customize basically a stream for them specifically to make sure that we captured those goods that were ending up in their garbage. So we said, okay, you don't have to split up, let's say, the hard toys from the soft toys and etc. You could just put it all together. And you know what? You can add in your purses and your belts and your shoes, like basically put it all together, like whatever is the most space efficient for you. Um, and do what you can, basically just divert it from the waste and put it on the truck to make it back to the warehouse. I think it was a fairly long process to make sure that those goods didn't end up in the waste, because another issue that came up after that was that, okay, now we're filling up these boxes, but like we're filling them up really fast, so we need two pickups in a day to make sure that we don't put the stuff in the garbage. So it was like, okay, let me work with the logistics team, let me figure out how we can have another run come to you, maybe one in the morning, one in the afternoon. So it took a lot of work to figure out, okay, what can we put in your back room? How can we get you service by logistics, so we make sure that the stuff doesn't end up in the waste? And then working with the waste hauler to say, okay, we don't actually need as many pickups as we did. This is why, and having those exciting conversations with them. Uh, yeah, so I guess that would be a tangible result. I forget what it went down to, but when I first started at Goodwill Industries, which is a nonprofit I work for, I think we were around, I want to say like 50-60% diversion rate. And when I left, it was in the 80s. So yeah, we moved up quite a bit. in the time that I was there, and waste audits was part of it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just wrote an article about an organization here in Phoenix that does something similar. They collect items for teachers so that way they can come in and pick out whatever they need for their classrooms. But they also take a lot of other things
Ah,
and you take that and move it to
yeah,
the next facility. Like they have a partnership with Boys and Girls Club or like a rage room where like electronics that come to them that are just broken, they can dip
yeah.
over there and let people destroy it. But yeah, I think that is so very important and super cool in my opinion. So
Yeah.
next question
Yeah.
is, what team is in charge of performing a I can't say that word, materiality or double assessment? I understand this may change from company to company, but what background is management looking for in the person in charge of this?
Hmm. Um, well, I can only speak to it from a perspective of a consultant, and it tends to be the CSO, Chief Sustainability Officer, or yeah, someone within their sustainability division. It can also be an ESG manager or an ESG leader. And to be Yeah, I'm not sure how often they outsource that work. We were talking to somebody from Amazon at Climate Week, and they said to have an 80-person team dedicated to doing materiality assessments, and I think that's just insane. So I think, yeah, depending on the size of the business, it may be a lot of different roles. Um, but for another also very large company that we work with, it's a one-person sustainability team, and they just outsource it to us. So I think it just depends on like how much they want to take on themselves versus outsource to consultants. But I would say, yeah, ESG, maybe sustainability officer, and the kinds of skills that you need for that. I think really just an understanding of regulatory compliance, the different standards, and also just being aware of upcoming changes is really crucial because it's fast moving, really fast evolving. So what is a standard today is probably not going to be standard 2 years from now. So yeah, being able to read, understand the regulations and predict trends and changes would be key.
Erica, does that answer your question? All right. So, kind of, I had a question as well,
Of
so
course.
I'm very interested in a nonprofit work. How do you convince a nonprofit to do these types of audits when their funding is limited, right? They only have so much grants or so much money coming in from donors. Why would it be important for them to think about doing these types of audits, especially like the waste audits? Because I feel like that could be a good place for them to start because they're most of the time they're smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think for nonprofits, again, because I've worked in them before, I think it's the driver can be that cost saving opportunity. Again, like I remember at the nonprofit I work with, we were always trying to save a buck here or there. And the fact is that there can be a lot of hidden resources in our waste streams. And until you go through it, you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know what you're throwing out that actually has value, that could be recycled or resold, reused somehow. Um, and the fun thing with a waste audit is that it can be as elaborate and extensive or as simplified and quick as you want it to be. So I started doing them as a intern, and of course I only did it like very kind of like a mini kind of waste audit. But I also knew people who were doing waste audits and charging $5,000 to $10,000, depending on how many sites you have. But like it could get pretty expensive pretty fast. So it can be done with a small crew. They can just kind of, do it yourself approach that will still give you enough insight of what are those low-hanging fruits? So like if you do a waste audit and you actually see a lot of paper, a lot of cardboard that could be recycled and perhaps you can get some money for it, like that's an opportunity right there. Um, or maybe it can just be recycled, but you pay a little bit less than you do for trash, so you can actually save on waste because now you're just paying a lower rate for your recycling. So basically, I'm just saying you could do it like a quick and dirty version that gives you enough insight to move forward with some kind of plan that will hopefully save you money.
Perfect. Everybody loves to save money. I think that's a
Who
lot of times
doesn't?
when I write stories or when I talk about climate, I have to put money into it because that's the way that people can relate, honestly. So,
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we all
perfect.
have like a motivator and a fear that we're trying to move
Yeah,
towards or away from.
definitely. Any questions from our audience? Anything else? All right. It does not look like I see any hands.
Well,
Well,
thank you,
perfect.
everyone. Thanks for coming. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. But yeah, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This will be recorded, and then the Terra Do community will be posting it at some point, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank
Have
you,
a
everyone.
wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks.
Oops, gotta stop the recording.